December 19, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Temperature -15°C. The column of American prisoners stretched for 2 miles through the snow-covered forest road. 7,000 men, frozen, wounded, defeated. The largest American surrender since Bataan. The Battle of the Bulge had shattered 2 entire regiments in 48 hours of brutal combat. Now they marched toward Germany and uncertain fate. Wehrmacht guards expected silence. Expected broken men shuffling toward captivity with heads down, spirits crushed. They'd seen it before with Soviet prisoners, French prisoners, British prisoners. Defeat looked the same in every language. Hollow eyes, slumped shoulders, the gray numbness of men who'd given up. But something was different about these Americans. From somewhere in the middle of the column, a voice started singing. Not quietly, not hesitantly, but loud, defiant, completely inappropriate for men marching to prison. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, the Marine Corps hymn, sung by Army infantry, in the middle of the worst American defeat of the European War. Other voices joined in, dozens, then hundreds. By the second verse, thousands of American soldiers were singing in unison, their breath creating clouds of vapor in the frozen air, their boots crunching through snow in rhythmic cadence. The German guard stared in disbelief. Hauptmann Klaus Reinhardt, veteran of the Eastern Front who'd marched thousands of Soviet prisoners to camps, had never seen anything like this. These Americans were singing, while defeated, while wounded, while marching to captivity, and their spirit, Reinhardt realized with growing unease, was completely unbroken. To understand what happened on that frozen Belgian road in December 1944, you must first understand the American military culture of 1944 and how fundamentally different it was from European military traditions. The Wehrmacht, and most European armies, operated on principles of hierarchy, discipline, and subordination of individual will to collective purpose. Soldiers were components of a machine. They obeyed, fought, and died as commanded. When captured, they accepted defeat with stoic resignation because resistance was futile and undignified. The American military was different. It was built on a citizen-soldier tradition where individual identity coexisted with military duty. American soldiers weren't professional warriors. They were civilians temporarily in uniform. They maintained their civilian personalities, their regional identities, their individual quirks. This created what European observers considered lack of discipline. American soldiers talked back to officers. They complained constantly. They maintained informal relationships across rank structures that would be unthinkable in German or British armies. But it also created resilience. American soldiers didn't derive their identity from military status. They were from Kansas, Brooklyn, Texas, Oregon. They were mechanics, farmers, teachers, factory workers who happened to be soldiers temporarily. Defeat didn't destroy their core identity because their core identity wasn't soldier. It was American. The 106th Infantry Division and 28th Infantry Division, the units shattered in the Battle of the Bulge's opening days, exemplified this American character. Most were drafted civilians with less than a year of training. They'd been overwhelmed by veteran Wehrmacht units in a surprise attack through terrain. American command had thought impassable. They'd fought well initially, but German armor, artillery, and numerical superiority had been overwhelming. Entire battalions were surrounded. Ammunition ran out. Communications collapsed. Officers made the hardest decision in warfare: surrender or die pointlessly. They chose surrender. 7,000 men laid down arms on December 19, 1944. Among them was Private First Class Robert Bobby Chen, 106th Division, a Chinese-American from San Francisco who'd been drafted in 1943. Also Staff Sergeant James Jimmy O'Connor, 28th Division, an Irish-American from Boston who'd volunteered after Pearl Harbor, and Lieutenant Thomas Hartwell, Pennsylvania National Guard officer from a coal mining town. These 3 men, different backgrounds, different units, different reasons for serving, would become the core of an unlikely resistance movement that began with singing and evolved into something the Germans couldn't comprehend. Because Americans, they were learning, didn't see surrender as ending the war. They saw it as changing the battlefield, and the new battlefield was psychological, proving to their captors and themselves that losing a battle didn't mean losing themselves. The singing started spontaneously, but it wasn't random. Private Bobby Chen, marching in the middle of the column, was freezing, exhausted, and terrified. He'd watched his best friend die from German machine gun fire 2 days ago. He'd surrendered with his hands up, expecting to be shot. Instead, he'd been herded into this massive column of defeated Americans. Around him, men were breaking down. Some cried. Others stared into nothing. A few muttered prayers. The psychological weight was crushing. They'd been told Americans didn't surrender. That capture meant disgrace. That their families would be ashamed. Bobby felt it too. The shame. The failure. The crushing realization that he'd survived when better men hadn't. Then someone started singing. Bobby never knew who. Just a voice from somewhere ahead in the column. The Marine Corps hymn. Ridiculous, since these were Army soldiers, not Marines. But that was the point. The song wasn't about accuracy. It was about defiance. Bobby knew the words from boot camp. Every American soldier learned that hymn even if they weren't Marines. It was cultural literacy, part of being in the U.S. military. So Bobby started singing along. Quietly at first, then louder. The man next to him, a farm kid from Iowa Bobby had never spoken to, joined in. Then the man ahead, then behind. Within 2 minutes, hundreds were singing. The sound carried up and down the column, men joining in at different points, creating a wave of voice that traveled through the entire 2-mile line of prisoners. The German guard's reaction was immediate and confused. Hauptmann Reinhardt shouted in broken English, "Silence, you are prisoners, no singing." But how do you enforce silence on 7,000 men simultaneously? Shoot them all? Beat them all? The logistics were impossible. Sergeant Jimmy O'Connor, marching near the front of the column, saw the German guards' uncertainty and understood instinctively. They'd found a weakness. The Germans could control their bodies, but they couldn't control their voices. Not without killing everyone. And dead prisoners couldn't be used for labor or propaganda. When the Marine Corps hymn ended, Jimmy started a new song. "You're in the Army Now," a satirical song about military life, completely inappropriate for the situation. And perfect. More men joined. The singing continued. Lieutenant Hartwell, wounded in the leg and barely able to walk, realized what was happening. This wasn't just morale maintenance. This was resistance. Active, deliberate, organized resistance through the one tool the Germans couldn't confiscate: American culture. And if they could resist through singing, maybe they could resist in other ways too. By the second day of marching, the singing had become organized. Not officially, there was no chain of command coordinating it, but through spontaneous consensus. Men took turns starting songs. When one voice tired, another would take over. The repertoire expanded. Military marching songs, popular music from home, Christmas carols, it was December, even college fight songs. Anything that reminded them they were Americans, not just defeated soldiers. The psychological effect was profound. Men who'd been suicidal on day 1 were joking by day 2. Prisoners who'd stopped caring about survival started helping wounded comrades. The column transformed from a death march into something else, a mobile community of men who refused to accept defeat. Hauptmann Reinhardt reported the phenomenon to his commanding officer, Oberst Friedrich Weber, at the first overnight stop. "Sir, the American prisoners are unusual." "Explain." "They sing. Constantly. We order silence. They ignore us. We threaten punishment. They continue. I have never seen prisoners behave this way." Weber, a veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, was skeptical. "Prisoners sing sometimes, usually hymns or folk songs for comfort. It means nothing." "This is different, sir. They sing military songs, patriotic songs. They sing in formation and rhythm with their marching. They are not seeking comfort. They are demonstrating that we have not defeated them psychologically." Weber came personally to observe. What he saw disturbed him. 7,000 prisoners packed into an open field surrounded by barbed wire, without shelter in sub-zero temperatures. They should have been broken, huddled for warmth, focused entirely on survival. Instead, they'd organized, designated areas for wounded, shared blankets and coats, and at sunset they sang, all of them, standing in formation as if on parade, singing the American national anthem. "Mein Gott," Weber whispered, "they're still soldiers. In their minds, they haven't surrendered at all." It was true. The Americans had reframed captivity mentally. They weren't prisoners who'd been defeated. They were soldiers continuing to serve by maintaining morale, organization, and unit cohesion under enemy control. Private Bobby Chen explained it to a German guard who spoke English. "You captured our bodies, but you didn't capture the 106th Division. We're still here, still together, still American soldiers." The guard reported this to Reinhardt, who included it in his reports to Wehrmacht Command. American prisoners demonstrate unprecedented morale and unit cohesion despite defeat. Recommend increased security measures and psychological warfare to break their spirit before they reach POW camps. But Wehrmacht Command didn't understand what they were dealing with. You can't break what was never dependent on winning. And American spirit, they were learning, wasn't contingent on victory. It existed independently. The Wehrmacht began active countermeasures to break American morale. They separated the column into smaller groups, hoping to fragment unit cohesion. They reduced rations further. They forced longer marches with fewer rest breaks. They confiscated photographs, letters, personal items, anything that reminded prisoners of home. None of it worked. When separated into smaller groups, Americans just sang in their new groups. When rations were reduced, they shared what little they had. When marches were extended, they sang cadence to maintain marching rhythm. When personal items were confiscated, they memorized songs, jokes, and stories to share orally. Staff Sergeant Jimmy O'Connor became the informal morale officer for his section. 300 men separated from the main column. He organized nightly singing sessions, joke-telling competitions, and what he called Remember Home sessions, where men would describe their hometowns in elaborate detail. "Why are you doing this?" asked a German guard who'd become curious about the Irish-American from Boston. "Because," Jimmy explained in his broken German, "you want us to forget we're American, to become just prisoners, just labor, just bodies you control. But as long as we remember home, remember who we are, you don't really control us, you control our location, but not us." The guard, a young conscript from Bavaria named Hans Müller, found this confusing. "But you lost. You are prisoners. How does singing change that?" "Doesn't change it. Just changes what it means we're prisoners' bodies, but American minds. That's the part you can't capture." Hans reported this conversation to his superiors, who dismissed it as American naivety. Germans understood reality. Prisoners were prisoners. Their psychological state was irrelevant to their material circumstances. But Lieutenant Hartwell, the wounded National Guard officer, understood something the Germans didn't. Morale was a force multiplier. High morale increased survival rates, reduced disease, maintained discipline. Men with strong morale helped each other, shared resources, resisted despair. He'd read military history before the war, accounts of other POW experiences. The pattern was clear. Prisoners who maintained group identity and morale survived at higher rates than those who became atomized individuals, focused only on personal survival. "We're not singing to annoy the Germans," Hartwell explained to a group of young privates. "We're singing to keep each other alive, because as long as we're together, as long as we maintain unit cohesion, we help each other survive. And survival is resistance." It was a philosophy that would define American POW experience for the rest of the war. Resistance through unity, unity through culture, culture through simple acts like singing together. The Germans controlled everything except what mattered most: the American refusal to become what their captors wanted them to be. December 28, 1944. Stalag 9B, Bad Orb, Germany. The American prisoners arrived at the POW camp after 9 days of marching through snow and ice. They'd walked over 200 kilometers in sub-zero temperatures with minimal food and no shelter. 43 men had died en route, mostly wounded who couldn't maintain the pace. But 6,257 Americans entered Stalag 9B singing "God Bless America." The German camp commandant, Oberst Ernst von Mannheim, watched the arrival from his office window with growing alarm. He'd run POW camps for 3 years. He'd processed Soviet, French, British, Serbian, and Italian prisoners. They always arrived the same way: broken, silent, grateful to stop marching. These Americans arrived singing. Von Mannheim called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. "What have we been sent?" Hauptmann Reinhardt, who'd marched with the prisoners, explained. "Americans, sir, but not typical prisoners. They have maintained military discipline, unit cohesion, and extremely high morale despite defeat and harsh march conditions. How is this possible?" "I do not know, sir. American military culture appears to be fundamentally different from European models. They do not see surrender as disgrace. They see it as tactical situation requiring adaptation." Von Mannheim studied reports from the march. The Americans had organized themselves without German permission, designated leaders, established supply networks for sharing resources, created medical teams to care for wounded. maintained nightly formations where they sang together. They're still functioning as a military unit, von Mannheim realized. They haven't surrendered psychologically. They've just changed location. This was a serious problem. POW camps functioned through learned helplessness and broken spirits. Prisoners were supposed to be focused on survival, not on maintaining military structure. But there was a deeper issue. The Americans were influencing other prisoners. Stalag 9B held 15,000 prisoners total. Soviets, French, Serbs, and now Americans. The previous prisoner populations were demoralized, focused on individual survival, frequently informing on each other to gain favor with guards. The Americans immediately began changing the culture. They shared their meager rations with Soviet prisoners dying of starvation. They organized joint singing sessions with French prisoners. They taught other POWs how to maintain morale through collective identity. Within 2 weeks, other prisoner groups were copying American methods. The French began singing La Marseillaise at formations. The Soviets organized communist solidarity songs. The Serbs sang traditional folk music. Von Mannheim watched his camp transform from docile labor source to a cacophony of defiant voices, and he couldn't stop it, because prisoner singing wasn't a violation of Geneva Convention, wasn't grounds for punishment, wasn't anything except annoying, but it was resistance, and it was spreading, and von Mannheim had no idea how to stop it. February 1945, Stalag 9B. The situation in the camp had deteriorated. Food rations were cut to 800 calories per day as Germany's logistics collapsed under Allied bombing. Medical supplies were non-existent. Dysentery, typhus, and starvation became the primary causes of death. The American prisoners faced a terrible choice: maintain group cohesion and share resources equally, or prioritize the strongest men who could work, and thus receive extra rations from the Germans. Private Bobby Chen, now one of the informal leaders of the American contingent, called a secret meeting of section leaders. "We're dying," he said bluntly. 23 men last week, 31 the week before. If we don't change something, we'll all be dead by summer. Staff Sergeant Jimmy O'Connor proposed the unthinkable. We stop sharing equally. We give extra rations to the men strong enough to work. They get German work rations. We use those to support the weakest men. It's cruel calculus, but it's survival. Lieutenant Hartwell shook his head. If we abandon equal sharing, we abandon what makes us American. We become individuals fighting for scraps. That's what the Germans want. That's when they win psychologically. But if we maintain equality, Bobby argued, we all die equally. Is that better? It was the fundamental tension of POW resistance. Short-term survival versus long-term identity. Pragmatism versus principle. They voted. The decision was narrow but decisive. Maintain equal sharing. No man gets extra rations even if he's stronger or working. Everyone receives the same portion, however small. It was a death sentence for some. The weakest men would die because they weren't receiving extra food, but it maintained American identity. We don't abandon each other. We survive together or die together. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Over the next month, 63 American prisoners died. Most were men too weak to recover even with equal food sharing. But something else happened. The Americans who survived became more unified. They'd chosen principle over pragmatism. They'd accepted increased death to maintain their values. And paradoxically, this strengthened group cohesion. Bobby Chen, watching men die from starvation despite their best efforts, questioned everything. Are we heroes or fools? We're letting men die to preserve an abstract principle. Lieutenant Hartwell, himself dying slowly from tuberculosis, responded, "We're neither. We're just Americans doing what Americans do, refusing to become something else even when becoming something else would be easier." It was cold comfort, but it was the only comfort available in a place where comfort didn't exist. And still, every evening, the Americans sang, weaker now, hoarser, but persistent, because giving up singing would be admitting defeat. And defeat was one thing they refused to admit. March 1945, Allied advance. The war was clearly ending. Soviet forces pushed from the east. American and British forces crossed the Rhine from the west. Germany was being crushed between two massive armies. But this created a new danger for POWs. The Germans might kill them rather than allow liberation, or force march them deeper into Germany, killing thousands through exposure and exhaustion. Oberst von Mannheim received orders from Wehrmacht Command. Prepare to evacuate Stalag 9B if American forces approach within 50 kilometers. Prisoners will be marched to camps in eastern Germany. Those unable to march will remain in camp. Everyone knew what remain in camp meant: execution or abandonment to die. Lieutenant Hartwell, now barely able to stand from advanced tuberculosis, called the senior American prisoners together. If they evacuate us, we march together. No one left behind. We carry the wounded. We maintain formation. We sing. That's suicide, protested one officer. Men will die on another forced march. They'll die faster if we abandon unit cohesion, Hartwell countered. Our survival has been about staying together. That doesn't change now. But there was debate. Should the Americans attempt escape during the chaos of evacuation? The guards were demoralized, undersupplied, distracted by approaching Allied forces. Organized mass escape might be possible. Staff Sergeant Jimmy O'Connor, ever pragmatic, laid out the problems. Escape to where? Germany is a war zone. We're in the middle of combat operations. We're weak, starving, unable to move fast. And if we're caught, Geneva Convention protections end. We become partisans subject to summary execution. So we just march where they tell us? Asked Bobby Chen. We march, Jimmy agreed. But we march as American soldiers. In formation. Singing. Maintaining discipline. And when Allied forces liberate us, not if when, we're still a functioning military unit. Not a scattered mob of escaped prisoners. It was decided. If evacuation came, they'd march. Together. Singing. The psychological warfare continued. The Germans wanted the Americans to panic, to scatter, to become individuals instead of a collective. The Americans refused. On March 28, 1945, advance scouts from the U.S. Third Army reached positions 12 kilometers from Stalag 9B. Von Mannheim received evacuation orders. At dawn on March 29th, guards began assembling prisoners for forced march. 6,000 Americans, those healthy enough to walk, were ordered to form marching columns. They formed perfectly organized ranks, maintained proper military spacing, and when the order to march was given, they began singing the Star-Spangled Banner in perfect unison. Von Mannheim watched from his office, something close to admiration on his face. Remarkable, he said to Hauptmann Reinhardt. They're going to die singing, and they know it, and they don't care. But he was wrong. They did care. They just cared more about dying as Americans than surviving as something less. The march lasted less than 18 hours. At 14 POWs on March 30th, 1945, advance elements of the U.S. 89th Infantry Division encountered a column of prisoners being marched by Wehrmacht guards on a rural road 30 kilometers from Stalag 9B. The American soldiers initially thought they'd found a German military column. Then they heard singing. American voices singing, "You're a Grand Old Flag." Captain Robert Henderson, leading the reconnaissance platoon, ordered his men forward cautiously. As they approached, the situation became clear. Thousands of American POWs being force-marched by German guards. The Wehrmacht guards, seeing American tanks and infantry, immediately surrendered. The POWs, seeing American uniforms, erupted in cheers, and then spontaneously began singing the national anthem. Private Bobby Chen, marching in the middle of the column, couldn't believe what he was seeing. "We're free," he whispered. "Holy shit, we're actually free." Staff Sergeant Jimmy O'Connor, tears streaming down his face, grabbed Bobby's shoulder. "We made it. We actually made it." But Lieutenant Hartwell, barely conscious and being carried by 4 other prisoners, managed a weak smile. "Told you. We'd make it. If we stayed together." Captain Henderson's men distributed their rations immediately. Chocolate, cigarettes, canned meat. The POWs, most weighing under 110 pounds after months of starvation, devoured food like starving wolves. Henderson's radio operator called in the situation. "We've liberated approximately 6,000 American POWs. Require immediate medical evacuation. Most prisoners are in critical condition but in remarkably high spirits. They're singing, sir. All of them. They're singing." The division commander, listening on the radio net, said simply, "That's the most American thing I've ever heard." Over the next 48 hours, the liberated prisoners were evacuated to field hospitals, then to hospitals in France and England, then eventually back to the United States. Oberst von Mannheim and his staff were captured. During interrogation, von Mannheim was asked about the American prisoners' behavior. "They were unlike any prisoners I have encountered," von Mannheim said. "We controlled their bodies, their food. their location, but we never controlled them. They remained Americans. They maintained discipline, morale, and unit cohesion, despite conditions designed to break them. It was, he paused, searching for words, admirable. Even as they were my enemy, I found their spirit admirable, the interrogating officer, a U.S. Army intelligence captain, wrote in his report. German captors clearly did not understand American military culture or the psychological resilience it creates. Americans refuse to accept psychological defeat despite material defeat. Recommend study of this phenomenon for future POW training. But the Americans themselves understood it perfectly. They'd sung because that's what Americans do. And they'd survived because they'd stayed together. It was that simple. And that profound. May 1945. Walter Reed Army Hospital, Washington, D.C. Private Bobby Chen, Staff Sergeant Jimmy O'Connor, and Lieutenant Thomas Hartwell were among the American POWs receiving extended medical treatment in the United States. All had lost significant weight. All suffered from chronic diseases contracted in captivity. Hartwell's tuberculosis was advanced and potentially terminal. They'd been invited to the War Department to participate in a study on POW survival and morale. A team of Army psychologists wanted to understand how the Stalag 9B prisoners had maintained such high morale under conditions that typically broke men. Dr. William Morgan, chief psychologist, interviewed them together. Gentlemen, you and your fellow prisoners demonstrated unprecedented psychological resilience. We need to understand why. What made you different? Jimmy O'Connor answered first. We weren't different. We were just American, and Americans don't quit. But objectively, you were defeated, captured, starving. Why didn't you break? Bobby Chen tried to explain. Because being American isn't about winning. It's about who you are regardless of circumstances. We were from different places, San Francisco, Boston, Pennsylvania, but we were all American. That identity didn't depend on whether we won or lost battles. It just was. Lieutenant Hartwell, speaking weakly from his wheelchair, added, The Germans tried to reduce us to just prisoners, just bodies, just labor. But we refused that reduction. We maintained identity through culture, singing, joking, remembering home. As long as we remembered who we were, they hadn't really defeated us. Dr. Morgan took extensive notes. The singing specifically, why that form of resistance? Because, Jimmy explained, it was something they couldn't take away. They controlled food, medicine, our bodies, but they couldn't control what was in our heads. The songs we knew, the culture we shared. Singing was proof that there was still something of us they hadn't destroyed. And it was communal, Bobby added. When we sang together, we weren't individuals, we were Americans. Plural, a group. That's harder to break than individuals. The psychologists documented everything. Their findings would influence U.S. military POW training for decades. The importance of maintaining cultural identity, unit cohesion, and collective morale. The study concluded. American prisoners who maintained group singing and cultural practices demonstrated mortality rates 40% lower than those who became isolated individuals focused solely on personal survival. But for Bobby, Jimmy, and thousands of others, the statistics were irrelevant. They'd sung because that's what felt right, because it reminded them of home, because it proved they were still themselves. The rest, the survival advantages, the psychological resilience, the resistance value, those were just side effects of being authentically American. June 1945. Post-war interviews. As more POWs returned home and were debriefed, a complex picture emerged. Not all American prisoners had maintained the singing tradition. Some camps had different cultures. Some groups of men had descended into individual survival mentality, hoarding resources, informing on each other to gain favor with guards. The question became, why did some American POW groups maintain resilient morale while others broke? Dr. Morgan's team identified 3 factors. Leadership. Units with strong NCO leadership maintained cohesion. Men like Jimmy O'Connor who organized activities, enforced fair resource sharing, and maintained military structure even in captivity. Early culture establishment. Groups that established singing and collective identity immediately after capture maintained it throughout captivity. Groups that spent even a few weeks in demoralized state rarely recovered. Critical mass. Resistance required enough participants to become normalized. If 70% of prisoners participated in singing and collective activities, the remaining 30% were drawn in. But if only 30% participated, they were isolated and gradually gave up. The Stalag 9B Americans had all three factors. They'd started singing during the initial march before arriving at camp. They'd had strong NCO leadership, and they'd achieved critical mass quickly, most prisoners participating from the beginning. But there was a darker truth too. The men who'd maintained their spirits had been predominantly white Americans. Black American soldiers, segregated into different sections of the camp and subjected to additional racism from both German guards and sometimes their own fellow prisoners, had different experiences. Private James Washington, a black soldier from Alabama who'd been in Stalag 9B, spoke about this in his debrief. We sang too, but our own white soldiers didn't always want us in their groups. The Germans treated us worse, and when we got home, we're still second-class citizens. So yeah, we kept our spirits up, but the American dream we were singing about, that didn't include us the same way. It was an uncomfortable truth that the psychological studies largely ignored. American resilience in captivity was real, but it was also racially stratified. The culture of collective identity worked best for those who were fully included in American identity. Dr. Morgan, to his credit, documented this. But his superiors in the War Department chose to emphasize the positive aspects: American resilience, cultural strength, morale maintenance, and downplay the complications. The official narrative became, Americans sang in captivity because they were American. The unofficial reality was some Americans sang together while others sang separately, or not at all. But even with these complications, the core truth remained. Those who maintained collective identity, regardless of race, survived at higher rates than those who didn't. Unity, however imperfect, was stronger than isolation. December 1945, Boston, Massachusetts. Staff Sergeant Jimmy O'Connor stood before a crowd of 200 people at the Boston Veterans Hall. He'd been asked to speak about his POW experience as part of a war bond drive. He was nervous. Public speaking terrified him more than combat had. People ask me, Jimmy began, what kept us alive in that camp. They want to hear about heroic acts, about elaborate escape plans, about dramatic resistance. But the truth is simpler, and maybe disappointing. We sang. That's it. We sang songs everyone knows. And somehow, that was enough. He paused, gathering his thoughts. The Germans had everything. They had guns, food, power, control. We had nothing. Just our voices and our memories. But those two things, voices and memories, turned out to be everything. When we sang God Bless America, we weren't in Stalag 9B anymore. We were home. When we sang the national anthem, we weren't prisoners. We were Americans. The songs didn't change our physical circumstances. We were still starving, still dying, still trapped, but they changed what it meant. I watched men die singing, not because singing saved them physically. It didn't. But because they died as themselves, not as broken prisoners. They died with identity intact. And somehow that mattered more than survival. The crowd listened in silence. I don't know if we were heroes. I think we were just stubborn. Too stubborn to let the Germans tell us who we were. We knew who we were. We were Americans. From Boston, San Francisco, Pennsylvania, Iowa, everywhere. And Americans sing. That's what we do. In good times and bad. When winning and when losing, we sing. So that's what we did. We sang. And it turned out that was enough. The applause was thunderous, but Jimmy felt uncomfortable with hero worship. He wasn't a hero. He'd just refused to stop being himself. After the speech, an older veteran from World War I approached him. Son, what you did, maintaining morale through culture, that's going to be remembered. That's going to be taught. Future soldiers will learn from you. Jimmy shook his head. I hope future soldiers never need to use those lessons. I hope there are no more wars, no more POW camps, no more men dying while singing. But if there are, the old veteran said, they'll know what you knew, that the spirit is harder to break than the body, and that Americans don't surrender who they are, even when they surrender militarily. It was a legacy Jimmy never wanted, but couldn't deny. He'd sung in captivity, and somehow, impossibly, that had mattered. April 1946. War Department, Washington, D.C. The final report on American POW experiences in European camps was completed. Dr. William Morgan presented his findings to a committee of generals, colonels, and psychological warfare experts. Gentlemen, our study covered 28,000 American POWs from various German camps. The findings are conclusive. Prisoners who maintained collective cultural practices, singing, organized activities, group identity, demonstrated survival rates 38% higher than those who became isolated individuals. More significantly, prisoners who maintained American cultural identity showed dramatically lower rates of collaboration with captors, faster psychological recovery after liberation, and better long-term mental health outcomes. The Germans attempted to break American morale through standard methods: starvation, isolation, punishment, demoralization. These methods had been effective against other nationalities. They were largely ineffective against Americans who maintained cultural cohesion. A general interrupted. Why? What made Americans different? American identity, Dr. Morgan explained, is not primarily tied to military success or national superiority. It's tied to cultural values and individual dignity. Americans believe they are American regardless of circumstances. This creates psychological resilience independent of material conditions. When we studied Soviet prisoners, we found their identity was often tied to communist ideology. When that ideology was challenged by defeat or propaganda, many broke. When we studied British prisoners, we found identity tied to military tradition and discipline. When that structure was destroyed by captivity, morale suffered. But Americans? Their identity was simpler. We're Americans because we're from America. We share certain values, and we maintain certain cultural practices. Singing those cultural songs, maintaining those values, that was enough. It didn't require victory. It didn't require military structure. It just required remembering. Another general asked, "Can this be trained? Can we teach soldiers to maintain this resilience?" We believe so. We're recommending new POW survival training that emphasizes cultural identity maintenance, group cohesion techniques, and psychological resistance through collective activities. The soldiers from Stalag 9B essentially invented these techniques spontaneously. We can systematize them. The report was approved. Over the next decade, American military training incorporated lessons learned from the singing prisoners: maintain identity, maintain unit cohesion, resist through cultural assertion, survive collectively rather than individually. But the deepest truth wasn't in the report. It wasn't quantifiable or systematic. The deepest truth was simply this: humans need to be themselves. And when everything else is taken away, freedom, food, hope, the need to be yourself becomes more important than survival. Bobby Chen, Jimmy O'Connor, Thomas Hartwell, and thousands of others had proven that. They'd sung not because it was strategic, but because it was authentic. And authenticity, it turned out, was the most powerful form of resistance. The Germans could capture Americans, but they couldn't make Americans stop being American. And that, finally, was the lesson that mattered most. Boston, Massachusetts, 1985. James O'Connor, now 70 years old, stood before a gathering of veterans, historians, and students at Boston University. A professor of military history had invited him to speak about his POW experience for a new book on psychological resilience in warfare. Jimmy's voice was still strong, his mind sharp, his memory of those months in captivity as clear as if they'd happened yesterday. "You want to know about resilience," he began. "About how we survived, about the singing. Everyone always asks about the singing." The audience leaned forward. "Here's what I've learned in 40 years of thinking about it. We didn't sing to survive. We sang because we were alive. That's a subtle but important difference. Survival would have meant doing whatever necessary to preserve our bodies, hoarding food, collaborating with guards, abandoning the weak, becoming whatever we needed to become to see one more day. But we weren't trying to survive. We were trying to live, to remain ourselves, to maintain dignity, identity, humanity. And for us, that meant singing. The songs weren't magical. They didn't create food or medicine. They didn't defeat Germans or end the war. What they did was simpler and more important. They reminded us who we were. I was Jimmy O'Connor from Boston. Bobby Chen was from San Francisco. Tom Hartwell was from Pennsylvania coal country. We were Americans, and Americans sing. In churches, at ball games, around campfires, in prison camps. We sing because singing is part of who we are. The Germans tried to make us into prisoners, just bodies, just labor, just defeated soldiers. We refused. We stayed Jimmy, Bobby, Tom. We stayed Americans. And singing was how we proved it to ourselves. A student raised her hand. "But sir, did the singing actually help?" Statistically, Jimmy smiled. Yes. Mortality rates were lower in groups that maintained singing. Recovery rates were faster. But I don't think that's why it mattered. It mattered because dying as yourself is better than surviving as something else. Tom Hartwell died of tuberculosis 6 months after liberation, but he died as Lieutenant Thomas Hartwell, American soldier from Pennsylvania, not as prisoner 24601, not as defeated labor, as himself. That's what resistance meant. Not defeating the enemy, but refusing to be defeated internally. The room was silent. So when people call us heroes, I'm uncomfortable. We weren't heroes. We were just Americans who refused to stop being American. That's not heroism. That's just identity. And identity, it turns out, is the thing humans will fight hardest to preserve. Jimmy paused, then added, if you remember nothing else from today, remember this. You can lose battles, lose wars, lose everything material, but as long as you remember who you are, you haven't lost everything. The Germans captured 7,000 of us, but they never captured America from inside our heads. We carried it with us, in songs, in memories, in values, in the simple refusal to forget where we came from. And that, more than any weapon or strategy, is why we won.